Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Singapore Book Council's inaugural Singapore Translation Symposium. And thank you for joining us here in our final session, Translation Across Borders, Voices from Southeast Asia and South Asia. My name is Dr. Alvin Pang. I'm a poet, writer, editor, and translator based here in Singapore, and I'll be chairing the session today. So before we begin, I would like to thank our partners, especially the National Translation Committee, for their generous support of the symposium. This session is organized in partnership with the Commonwealth Writers, the cultural initiative of the Commonwealth Foundation. First, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists and speakers for today's session. We have with us Bilal Tanweer, whose novel The Scatter Here is Too Great won the Shakti Bhatt First Book Prize and was shortlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and the Chautauqua Prize. The novel was even translated into German and French. His writings have appeared in local and international magazines, including Granta, the New York Times, Dawn, and Caravan. Next, we have Nazry Bahrawi, a literary translator, critic, and academic. Nazry hopes to introduce Anglophone readers to Malay literature through translation. He has translated 2 Singaporean literary works by Cultural Medallion winners from Malay into English. As an academic, he specializes in the study of non-material cultures in literary texts and films of the Malay archipelago. We also have with us Pauline Fan, who's a writer, literary translator, cultural researcher, creative director of cultural organization Pusaka, and the director of Georgetown Literary Festival in Malaysia, Malaysia's largest international literary festival. Pauline's translation of poems by Sarawak poet Kule Grasi, Tell Me, Kenyalang, was shortlisted in the US for the 2020 National Translation Award in Poetry and longlisted for the Best Translated Book Awards in 2020. And last but not least, we have Subashree Krishnaswamy, a writer, translator, editor, and teacher. She won the Sahitya Akademi Translation Prize in 2018 for her translation of the critically acclaimed The Tamil Story, Through the Times, Through the Tides, edited by Dilip Kumar. Her book, The Babel Guide to South Indian Fiction in Translation, was published by Babel Books in the UK. She has also edited and translated an anthology of Tamil poetry, Rapids of a Great River, published by Penguin. So, today's panel will look at some of the barriers to literary translation in Southeast Asia and South Asia, as well as local initiatives and efforts to support translation. We will also want to be considering how we can encourage translations between countries and cultures so that our literature collectively can be appreciated beyond our borders and enrich the diverse narratives of our communities. To begin with, I've asked our panelists back home to think about 2 questions and to kick off our conversation with a few initial thoughts and responses. And then we will have a free flow conversation that we hope will also involve you, the audience, as well. So the 2 questions I've posed to our panelists to think about are these. First, what do they think are the most important issues or challenges facing translation today? And second, what is the future of translation? Where is translation going tomorrow? So instead of 4 papers being presented, we will have a conversation. And please do join us. There is a Q&A function in the comments. Please, if you're in the audience, please feel free to pose questions for our panelists, and we will fold you in at some point during our time today. But to kick us off, let's first hear from Bilal. Bilal, please.
Thank you so much, Alvin, and thank you so much, Singapore Translation Symposium, as well as the Commonwealth Foundation for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And thank you so much for this prompt, Alvin. I think it's an important question for us to consider. And I think I will just start us out by talking about what, in my view, is a certain kind of global provincialism that pervades the translation world, particularly in the Anglophone world. And just going to assume that we are talking about the Anglophone world when we talk about translation. Um, so I think that writer Amit Chaudhary sort of describes this in his in his essay called Market Activism. And he describes this phenomenon since the 90s, late 90s, where agents and publishers in the Anglophone world abandoned the traditional forms of valuation by which novelists, and I would extend this to other forms of writing at large, that the form of valuation for these writings, and how do you value literature as a whole, and they kind of move to a more, Amit Chaudhary describes this as a literal valuation, which basically means monetary compensation. And we saw this trend all over the world, where we saw a consolidation of big publishing houses, and more greater corporatization of these houses, of publishing all over the world. The effect that that sort of had on what the literature that was being produced, um, was quite significant, because these publishing houses had a certain idea that they were looking for a big book, a book that would create and have a global readership, and it would attend to the big global questions that are important to the times across the globe. And I think that that had a significant impact on what was being published, but also, more importantly, what was being translated. Um, but obviously, I think that the big impact that the translation felt was that there weren't enough resources and avenues available for translation. We all know the famous 2% of figure that constitutes the translation percentage of the total works being published in English, particularly in North America. So I think that it created a certain kind of a global provincialism, both in terms of what was being published and the questions these works were kind of talking about, and publishers were kind of open to certain kinds of questions. Now I think that what and I think the situation for writers and translators, particularly in the global south, was even worse, in the sense that for us, if we are translating into English, we have to go through these big metropolitan centers and publishers located there. So London and New York, in large part. Um, so 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 once we kind of begin to attend to, or train our ears to their concerns, I think that the what is available for us to translate, or what can potentially be considered for publishing, in terms of translation, is extremely narrow, and even there it's very difficult to kind of get through. And I think that for me, that is the biggest sort of challenge that writers and translators in the Anglophone world have faced. And I think that what we have failed to do, alongside this, is create avenues that would counter this current, this larger current. And I think, in that respect, the project that we did, with the Commonwealth Foundation, myself and Pauline Fan, we guest edited uh, works of translation from the entire region, from South Asia to Southeast Asia. And I think that that sort of avenue is precisely the antidote that's required, to in order for us to hear smaller voices, local histories, what is happening in the vernaculars, and bring these smaller histories and these, you know, so-called smaller voices to kind of attend to these larger questions that are important to a global audience. But I think that what is happening right now is that because the big publishers are in a rush, or have this anxiety to find the next big global novel or next big global translation, something like Elena Ferrante, for example. I'm nothing against Elena Ferrante. I love her work. I'm a big fan. But you know, I think that that's more and more, you know, what publishers want. And I think that what we really need to do is perhaps create avenues that will offer us ways to publish, to reach audiences with voices that are perhaps not directly speaking to these large histories and large concerns and large questions. But these are smaller but nonetheless very important voices. And I think that we were able to do some of this work in our in the project we did, thanks to the Commonwealth Foundation.
Gauntlet right away and cutting to the chase, as it were, of market forces, essentially the corporatization of literary publishing. And it does beg a question that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about today, which is outside the Anglophone centers that have dominated what we consider to be global publishing today. What else are the other cultures and societies that are coming up doing, right? What about the Asian societies that we hail from, which are, it's funny that we say they are small. They are not small, of course, if we look at them in terms of numbers. Your Indias and Chinas and the larger Asia Pacific. Are we speaking among ourselves, with each other, sidestepping, as it were, the middleman? It is a question to ask. And I think Pauline might have something to add to this as well. So thank you, Bilal. And let's hear from Pauline next.
Hello, thank you, Alvin. Thank you so much to the Singapore Translation Symposium, Singapore Book Council, and also Commonwealth Writers for inviting me to this wonderful panel. These questions, Alvin, are extremely important, and I really do echo Bilal's concerns and also his points about the global provincialism. I think that is one of the main issues that we need to address and think about as translators and as publishers and as people who are working in the field of literature. What I would like to also perhaps talk about is there are also imbalances, of course, in the national landscapes as well. I think one of the main challenges in Malaysia, for example, is the fact that in a very complex landscape, and Singapore is very similar to Malaysia in some respects and also quite different in other respects. But I think our societies are incredibly complex, incredibly multilingual, and organically chaotic by nature. And I think the 50, 60 years of nation building since independence has in some ways tried to, I think, present and embrace in a national kind of way an idea of diversity, which is somehow sometimes reflective and sometimes very unreflective of the actual realities on the ground. And I think sometimes when these constructions of identities are imposed in institutionalized forms, and in Malaysia, for example, it has been very much institutionalized. The entire project of national language, the entire project of national literature has become a state project, and one that is really implemented in systematic ways through institutions. And while, so I do want to point to, of course, the big institution of Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka, which actually has been, it was in the 70s, a place that really allowed literature to flourish and was publishing fantastic work and encouraged a lot of things like experimentation in the Malay language and allowed Malay writers to kind of find a kind of modernism in their language. However, I think over the decades, it has also become mired in a kind of institutionalized bureaucracy, which is inevitably bound up with the kind of state ideology of constructed identities. And therefore, a lot of what is produced and what is translated even and highlighted as national literature is also very problematic. We don't consider literature from minority languages as national literature at all, actually. We don't, and even the Malay language in all its diversity has become something that's very, very reductive. When in fact, the Malay language is not only spoken by the Malay community, it's also spoken and written and imagined by a vast majority of the population in Sabah and Sarawak, for example, are very fluid in the way they use Malay. It's a different kind of Malay, perhaps. And the way they use the language is very organically different and also suffused with their indigenous languages. And those kinds of literary expressions are not really recognized or embraced that much by the institution or the establishment of literary production in the Malay language. So one of the things which is essential, I think, for Malaysia, and I would imagine it's a similar need in Singapore and also in South Asia, which is so diverse actually in its languages, is also the need to actually even translate each other. Because in Malaysia, what we have is we actually have many, many literary communities that are producing work. Very often we're not talking to each other, and very often we can't really have even a proper conversation because we're not reading and translating each other. And that's one of the essential things that I feel needs to happen. So there is that global provincialism. There is also this national provincialism, and then communal. Within the nation state, you have these little communities which fall into a kind of insularity. And the problem then, of course, in making everyone fit into neat categories is that they themselves become defensive and insular within themselves. That's one of the main problems, I think, of Malay in the Malaysian literary landscape, for sure. And I completely agree with Bilal. The projects like Adda really do open up a space, and I was really thrilled to be part of that project. We have a few slides actually that we could show. You can go visit the addastories.org, which is the Adda website. So Bilal and I co-curated and edited a collection in four issues, and it features, I think, about 32 to 35 pieces of new translations into English, but across about 15 different languages from Southeast Asia and also South Asia. And this was really a wonderful project because I think we really didn't just look at those the national languages of each of those countries. There were many, many so-called minority languages that and works that I think even for Bilal and I were really surprising, because some of these writers we had read before and heard of, but many of them were new to us, and I think it was a really refreshing look and insight into just the vast creative sea that we actually come from. And I think we need more of those opportunities to nurture this creative sea, I think.
Yeah. Pauline, thank you so much. And it's a theme very, very close to my heart. A lot of my research and practice has been in this direction as well, of addressing the global shortfall, as it were, the global provincialism you talk about. But also, we don't do ourselves favors, right? We're not ourselves looking at each other and making those connections, but instead we're falling into these patterns of very fossilized, static, fixed ideas of who we are and what our literatures are. But I think in recent years, there have been efforts like yours and Bilal's. There have been efforts by those like those of our next speaker to really push back against that. And I think the opportunities of the internet and other opportunities like working with the Commonwealth Foundation and others and making connections across borders has given us a chance to do something about it. So let's hear from our next speaker, Nazry, whose recent projects, I think, really speak to precisely this agenda, this need. Nazry.
Thank you, Alvin. And thank you also to the Singapore Book Council and to the Commonwealth Foundation for this session. So I want to talk about translation from an epistemological viewpoint. And I know this is a big word, but it's really just about the idea of how we come to know what we know about ourselves and the world at large. And my primary concern here is the word decolonization, and I'll explain a little bit more later. But how do we decolonize literary translation? And in particular, I want to talk about how do we channel the works and voices of translators from marginal groups, right? And I talk about this, and I think about the backlash to the translation of Amanda Gorman's poem to Dutch and to Catalan early this year amidst furor over not hiring Black translators, right? Because it's a poem, of course, about Black experiences, right? And some people say that that language should be the mastery of a certain language should be the primary feature in which you should judge whether a person should translate or not. And I think here, unfortunately, I don't agree with that, because I don't think neither language nor translation itself is a neutral act, right? So I'm quite a firm believer of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and this is another academic term, but it really basically means that the language in which you speak and also constructs the way you think or you see the world, right? So, for example, some languages are gendered. English, for instance, have the third gender pronoun, right? And now increasingly there is a demand for you to outline how you would like to be pronounced, right? And also, if you think about French and Arabic language, gender is also pushed onto nouns and things, right? So things could be nouns and stuff like that. Whereas in the Malay language, there is no such thing as a gendered pronoun or even gendered things, right? The third person pronoun for he, him, she, her is dia, right? Just basically dia, dia, right? And this is important because I think about a Malay folklore from the Sejarah Melayu, a folklore that in Singapore matters. It's basically a folklore that gives the name of Bukit Merah or Red Hill. And this is a folklore about a young child that was so smart that he or she actually saved Singapore from a garfish attack. The garfish is a kind of fish that looks like a swordfish, right? Okay, yep. So what I'm trying to say is that when it's translated by colonial powers or colonial translators, such as I can't remember colonial translators now. R.O. Winstead is one of them. But this folklore was the child in that folklore was translated to be a male boy. I mean, a male person, right? And so a boy, and so this was later on picked up even in Malay literary imaginary as a boy as well. It's produced as a black and white film in the 1960s. But then the original word that was used is budak, and budak is not gendered, so it could also be actually a female child, right? And so it's very interesting to think that clever child that saved Singapura from the garfish attack and was later executed by the Sultan for some reason could actually have been a female child. And I imagine how that would be in thinking about the way we come to know about the world that we know today, that idea of decolonization, right? And so my counter argument is to the position of that idea of the mastery of language is that this could lead to mistranslations, and that could then become entrenched as truth. And this is why I think it matters that the translation of non-Western literary texts, or even texts by marginal writers, should actually also be translated by marginal voices too. And I think not just because of mastery of language, but because of the experiences that such a person could bring into the translation. But also, I would say this last bit, that decolonization itself is very tricky because it has become certainly a buzzword that is thrown around very easily and may lose a bit of that meaning. Academics Stuck and Young, for instance, wrote a very famous article that is titled "Decolonization is not a metaphor," and it's not a placeholder, basically, for issues of social justice. And it's really a valid argument in terms of especially settler colonies like North America, like Canada, Australia, and stuff like that. But I might also want to think about how the idea of decolonization might work in a situation like Singapore, for instance, where where the idea of decolonization of the mind exists. And I'm referring here to a much earlier writing by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who talks about the decolonization of the mind, who argues that colonization has the aspect of the material, but also has the aspect of the abstract, which is the mind, basically. And here I want to move on to try to answer the second part, which is the future of translation. And really my basic point is that I would love to see more works translated from marginal cultures by BIPOC translators to circumvent the issue of the global as well as the local provincialism that both my previous speakers have talked about. And I just want to end this part by talking about how I try to do that in my work. And if I can have the slide, I'll quickly talk about it. And so my latest work is called Singapura, which is on the left side of the screen here. And so and this is really a means in which I try to translate Malay literary writing. So Malay literary writings in Singapore is provincial, but also within the Malay literary world, Singapore Malay writers are provincial as well. So there's a kind of double provincialism operating here. And so what I noticed, and while I was translating this book, was to consider what Malay writing can bring out to the world, Malay writing from Singapore. And here certainly there is a certain aliran. Aliran means literary movement. But in Singapore, sometime during the late 2010s, there was a kind of literary non-movement. And I call it literary non-movement precisely because it's not organized, and it's bits and pieces of writers writing, but all writing in the similar style of a kind of speculative fiction. I think that's one way in which we could consider how we could try to see how a marginal piece of work could actually say something more about the world. Oftentimes when writers or translators from the global south try to put themselves out there, it would often be taken as something that is not speaking to the universal. And I think it's very important for marginal writers to try to speak to the universal, and for translators or even critics out there to try to recognize that this is something that could be bigger than than within its province, right? And so I think I'll end there, and I look forward to our discussion later. Thank you.
Nazry, thank you very much. It always strikes me that we speak of ourselves in these terms of the minority and the universal and the majority, when if you think about it, the Asia Pacific in absolute numbers occupies a bigger chunk of humanity than the languages and the metropole centers that we're translating into and marketing to. But lots to talk about there. But let's hear from our final panelist here, Subashree, who has herself done this work of translation, done this bridging work, and also produced work that speaks to the UK, the readerships that we're talking about, while being very grounded in the cultures that she's familiar with and hails from. Subashree, please.
Thank you so much, Alvin. And thank you, the Singapore Translation Symposium, for inviting me. And thank you, the Commonwealth Foundation as well. I completely agree with the previous speakers, but I'd also like to say a little bit about the situation in India, which is a little different. Now, the Sahitya Academy, which gave me this award for the translation, I won it for the English language. Now, it gives as you know, India's got so many languages, and they actually give awards every year for every language. So there is that kind of, they really want people to translate into each other's languages, not only to English. Now, this I won it for English, of course, and but there are interactions between other languages as well. And this one thing I want to say about translation in general. I don't know what it is like in other countries, but in India, most translators, it's almost like an inner calling or an inner compulsion. What they actually usually do is, they read some text and they engage with it so much that they would like to share it with people who can't access the language. So that's how actually most of us work. Now, this anthology, which I put together with Dilip Kumar, It is a mammoth anthology of 88 stories, and it traces the evolution of the short story in Tamil from the time it, the genre appeared in Tamil. So from the earliest story, and we traced it till 2000. Now, there were certain decisions that I made. I completely agree with the previous speakers when they say that the global publishing world, they need a certain kind of a book. Now, I was very clear when I translated this book that I wanted primarily other Indian readers who can't access Tamil to read it. So, you take certain decisions when you write for your readers in your country. Thankfully, India, we do have a publishing industry which publishes translation. And, I don't think I was so much bothered about getting it into the global world. I primarily wanted other Indians to enjoy. So, with that in mind, I actually took quite a few risks. For instance, though the descriptions were all standard English, what I did with the dialogue was I used English as it is spoken in India today. And as you very well know, we speak a different kind of English because we bring our baggages into English as well, the baggage from our Indian languages. So, in fact, in various parts of India, English is spoken a little differently. People who speak Hindi, they probably pepper it with Hindi, and in southern India, in Tamil, you use a certain language. Now, especially with dialogues, especially if the conversations are casual and so I tried to I took this enormous risk and thankfully paid off, and I think readers liked it, and because I wanted them to hear the cadences of Tamil as well. So, as you know, we all use the wrong tags, right? So, if you're with a group of friends, you'd say, "We're going for lunch. Is it?" Now, "is it" is such a wrong tag, but that's how people speak casually, So, I wanted to capture that. When people speak casually. Now, if you put it very correctly and say, "We are going there, are we?" Now, there only a certain kind of people would speak like that in India. Of course, these people don't speak English in the original language, but then you kind of imagined that if it is conversational, how do you bring that across? So, in that sense, I first wanted, readers in other parts of India who can't access Tamil to access these marvelous stories, which actually traces the evolution of Tamil society as well, because it starts with 1913, the first story, and it goes on till 2000. So, and if the rest of them pick it up abroad, that's fine. But I primarily wanted, thankfully, we do have a committed readership, dedicated readership there. So that's in one way, I wasn't so much looking at the global market. And because also most translators, I don't know, as I said, how it is in other countries, there's not much money, and they really feel that they have to, share this something wonderful that they got from the original text with people who can't access the language. Now, it's also sad that the past couple of years, this COVID has happened because translations were beginning to be noticed even in the global scene. And, the literary awards, translations won some major literary awards. And, people were getting interested in talking about translations. And unfortunately, the last 2 years, nothing much has happened. But I'm so glad that, that there are projects like what Pauline and Bilal are doing, which is really wonderful. I really hope that there are more projects like that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Subashree, thank you so much for that and for taking us home, as it were. So we began with the idea of the global marketplace and how it in a way, shackles and constraints us. And you've brought us home and reminded us that one important purpose of literary work, including translation, is to speak with each other and with ourselves, among ourselves, as it
Yeah.
were. And that's an important part of the purpose of translation as well. And to what extent do we do that? It also reminds me of some of the projects I believe the folks in Malaysia, Pauline and Edine, have done to bring the work of good global writing into Malay to
Yes.
enrich discourse and conversation at home. So it's not just about us exporting our stories for sale, for global sale, but in a sense, bringing in, enriching, and nourishing ourselves. And that's something I think it's worth talking about as
Absolutely.
well, right? Why should we not also benefit? Why should we only mine our own stories to sell, as it were? I maybe that's something to talk about to begin with. If I may have all the panelists together on screen, what do you think of that? Of what we've all shared so far, which has a lovely sort of resonance. What do you think of that?
Well, can I go
Bilal,
first if
yeah,
that's okay?
perfect.
So I think that I mean, thanks to prompts by Subashree and Pauline and Nazry, I think that I'd like to add to what I said earlier, and I think perhaps qualify a little bit. What I meant is, and again, obviously, I'm looking at a particular context in Pakistan where
Yeah.
publishing is actually, we don't have strong publishing ecosystem, particularly for English language works. And I think for us, publishing industry in India was always a great blessing, and actually a great resource, because again, I think that it enabled and continues to enable, in fact, writers from this part of the world, and as well as translators actually, who can access good editors and good publishing and good distribution. Unfortunately, in the last couple of years, that channel has also been affected because of the ties between the two country. So I think that for Pakistan, I think the Anglophone scene was being sustained by the Indian publishing industry, and they do a world class job of publishing and so on. I think that it's extraordinary what they bring. But again, if you're talking about a context where such a publishing ecosystem does not exist, so then we have to look at these, we have to speak to each
Yeah.
other via these
Yeah.
roundabout ways. And
Yeah.
I think that that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
And I think that, Alvin, what you said is absolutely correct, and I think that I would like to endorse it, or endorse is perhaps not the right word, but perhaps echo it with as much force as I can, that really, I think that we sort of inhabit a region that was always connected, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
ideas, stories, conversations flowed through this entire region. And I think that that's what my learning was when I had opportunities to travel to India, to attend literary festivals in India, that this is what I learned, that the most relevant conversation, the most relevant ideas that I encountered were coming from actually all of these thinkers and writers from our own region. And I mean, these are not people that you hear or are being published in London or
Yeah.
New York and so on. But unfortunately, we don't have Indian publishing scene aside, but I think for each one of our countries, I think at least for Pakistan, I can say we don't have a robust publishing scene which can really help us bring these conversations together, channel our energies together, create these conversations and avenues. And I think that this is one of our big challenges,
Yeah.
to create institutions going forward that will allow us to have these conversations together, to build or rebuild these ties and connections that were present historically and were very robust, but have been lost and have kind of faded, because of largely the orientations of our nation state and their priorities. So because, at least again for Pakistan, we kind of tend to look west, and now China, because obviously they're giving us a lot of money. So I think that that's where so whatever conversation happens through those sort of channels, and I think that kind of disrupts the natural flow of conversation, if I may.
Very resonant point. Nazry, you've been nodding. I think you have.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what Bilal has just commented on, and I'm really I'm struggling hard to think of what that institution could be, and I think that actually thinking about it, I'm not saying that Singapore is like the best place in the world or something like that, but there's certainly a lot of resources that have been pumped into the arts scene here to try to build up the literary marketplace. And I think actually one possible means through which we could start building up on these kind of conversations and not go about it in a roundabout way was I was just thinking about the Singapore Writers Festival, but then I was thinking about Pauline and the Georgetown Literary Festival, and then in Bali we have the Ubud Festival, which kind of happened around the same time and in the same region. And I'm not sure about South Asia. I wish I knew more about the festivals there, but the festival circuit really is something that we could look closer at in terms of building that kind of network. And I'm thinking about a scholar who has passed, who wrote this book called The World Republic of Letters, and how European, kind of like North American or Anglophone literature really, or European literatures really flourished, is because of these global literary marketplaces centered in Paris, in the UK and in the US. And who's to say that we cannot build those kinds of literary, marketplaces, like centers within this region of the global South, if you want to put it that way. And I'm just thinking about Singapore just because of the resources that is available here, and the kinds of support that maybe somebody like myself or others like yourself, Alvin, could kind of lobby for. And certainly not just Singapore. I'm not saying should be that center, but certainly one of those places.
Well, the interesting thing, isn't it, that pre-colonial times and coming up to pre-independence, Singapore was a major publishing center and center of learning for, say, Malay writing and so on. A lot of those histories have been forgotten, and the same is the case for many other places in South Asia, so on and so forth. But going to your point, Nazry, and then Bilal's point is, we definitely need these connections again, these networks, and it's not about any one place being the institution, right? It's about recovering that energy, recovering that desire, that eros, that yearning to connect. Like we have to want to do it, right? There's no point forcing these things. There's no point inventing agencies and cracking the whip. Where do we find that longing for each other that will make us want to do this work? Everything else follows, as it were. I don't know if my fellow panelists agree with me. I think we are here today, and absolute kudos to the Commonwealth Foundation and to the Book Council. They too feel this eros, this passion, this wanting to connect, and this is one such connection, one of many, I hope. Right? Where do we find that, and how do we nurture this desire? I think that's something we might want to reflect on. Pauline, you
yes, I think so. I absolutely agree with everyone, Bilal, Nazry, Alvin, absolutely. And it was lovely to hear all of your perspectives, Subashree as well. I think those connections are already happening. I think they are happening in small ways. They need to be amplified. They need to be strengthened. They need to be sustained in meaningful ways. Very often, I think many of us have that passion. Many of us have that eros, Alvin. But how do we sustain that and channel them into very kind of more sustained efforts, I think, and really have a conversation that can start supporting each other. But you're right, Nazry. I think the festival circuit is also definitely a way. Singapore Writers Festival, and a few weeks later, the Georgetown Literary Festival, and also, of course, Ubud, that happens sometime quite soon. But yeah, I think that maybe the festival circuit, we're not talking to each other enough, partly because I know I can speak only for the Georgetown Literary Festival's experience. We are passionate about literature. In fact, literature and translation, the literary translation, is a huge part of our program. And actually, even myself and the curator, Izzuddin Ramli, are translators. And so the way we approach the curation is always kind of centered in that as well. But I think for our case, we're just a tiny team and kind of lacking the resources that perhaps something like Singapore has a bit more of. However, we have other things. I mean, Penang was also a cosmopolitan center of publishing in the 19th and early 20th century as well, much like Singapore. And so perhaps also to recover those kinds of histories and identities, which are still there, they need to be rediscovered, I suppose, and strengthened. And I think a lot of these efforts will come from independent efforts, not necessarily nation state. I don't think we need to keep looking at the nation state. I think actually even literary translation is the perfect way to disrupt all those things, to disrupt the borders of nation state, to disrupt our notions of ourselves. And of course, in partnership with people and organizations who believe and who have also resources like the Commonwealth Foundation, like the Singapore Book Council, and like others also in Malaysia who are similar-minded, and elsewhere, India, Pakistan. I mean, let's perhaps we need to make a more sustained and concentrated effort to actually bring some of these initiatives together.
Very well said, Pauline. Thank you for that. And in fact, in many of our experiences, the national institutions are the ones, in a sense, discouraging this. I'm just thinking of, Subashree mentioned the Indian English, the world Englishes and the particular forms of English used in India that she wanted to celebrate. In Singapore, of course, we've got our Singlish, that on a national level is being actively discouraged. So if you go by the institutions, you wouldn't see that, but it is very much beloved. In fact, I think we still have our Speak Good English movement, where you go online and they teach you how to speak proper English and pronounce important English words like croissant and baguette and espresso and pizza.
All of us colonized people, Alvin. All of us colonized people.
Talk about decolonizing the mind and literature and all that. I mean, where do we even start, right? I guess it starts here. Subashree, do you want to say a bit more about how you push back against some of these things?
Because we speak English very differently, right? And if you want to, even among a group of friends, okay, if you're going for lunch, you're coming, no. That's how you say it. You're coming, are you? Nobody, speaks that formally. And if you spoke that formally, it's actually a marker, the kind of personality that you are. So if you're talking about a very casual person, they wouldn't speak like that. Even we don't speak to friends like that, And then, the present continuous tense, which the Indian subcontinent is famous for. If she had one of the, characters in the book, she tells her husband, if she had a smart husband, will she be suffering like this? Nobody talks like this, right? When if they talk proper English, but that's the way we speak. And it's a very casual conversation between the husband and wife. Now, if she says, would she suffer? Wouldn't she? Nobody speaks like that, right? So at least in dialogues, I think you should take these risks. But it's okay. I mean, description, I was very careful. I used the standard English. But I think dialogues, we can really let ourselves go. I mean, that's the risk that I took. Yeah.
Thank you. Very helpful. One of the things that maybe we should be doing more of is play, right? I mean, there's such an important aspect of art and of literature is, yes, there are markets, yes, there are livelihoods, yes, there are national pressures and cultural pressures and pieties, but where then also is the role of play, and I think translation, coming back to that, Eros, that idea of playing with the language is so important. In literature, and that's part of it as well. And I think there is a lot of ways in which that allows for the sorts of growth and curiosity and creativity that speaks to what we value in this work, both literary work and translation.
Yes.
And by the way, those of you who are listening in, please feel free to start, shooting your questions at us. Comments, hate mail, we're going to pick up your comments. Please give us your questions, even as we continue our conversation, right? Play. How do we play together? How do we find ways to play, be playmates, form a playground in which we can do more of these things?
Yeah.
So I think
Bilal.
that I'll just thanks Alvin. So a couple of things. I think that with all due not just respect but I think great affection for the literary festival, I think that even that form is speaking to a kind of a global spectacle, right? And I think that that's what literary festivals. I mean, I think that the quintessential template has been set by the Jaipur Literary Festival, right? Which is this global spectacle of like global literary stars. I'm not saying that all literary festivals are designed like that, but I think that there is a certain form and of conversation that takes place at a literary festival, which is panels, which is putting a bunch of writers together and then asking them questions and then they kind of answer. I think that perhaps we need to think, and this is a question that I don't have an answer for, but it's a question that I've thought about a lot, that perhaps we can inspire or provoke new kinds of conversations by coming up with different forms of interaction as well, right? And I think that play is an interesting prompt to think of, right? So rather than having a panel conversation, perhaps creates some kind of something where people can come in the spirit of play, as you are saying. I mean, I kind of think back to this institute that I was fortunate to be a fellow at in Germany. And one of the things that they used to do was that they would invite all the judges who would make a selection of people of the fellows who would stay on at this institute, Academy Schloss Solitude. And they would bring the judges together for a week, and the judges would just read all the entries together and would dine together and have lunch together. And what very often happened was that the judges themselves formed collaborations, and obviously the institute was willing to offer them resources to sort of do projects of their own. So I thought that again, we have to kind of think of innovative ways for people to meet, and for people to collaborate and create those possibilities and conditions for collaboration, because I think that perhaps the poverty is also in our imaginations and the forms of meetings that we kind of sort of we create for people, and that sort of creates a certain you know that determines what kind of outcomes uh, take place, really.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Bilal. And I'm just thinking back to that project you're doing for the journal titled Adda, right? Which is,
Right.
in my understanding, also a form of salon and gathering
Right.
in itself. So again, shifting the idea of the sort of commercial festival to something else entirely, different ways in which we can connect across communities. And speaking of communities, we have a question from the audience that maybe we can pick up at this point. And it's to do with fan fiction. Surely you want to talk about communities and reading, and that's a big part of it, right? So here's the question. What do you think of unofficial fan translations or fan fiction? What part do you think they play in the greater literary environment or sphere? Any takers?
Maybe I'll just
Nazry, yeah.
just start, because I think this is an important question, and it's a question about, like you said, Alvin, community, but also a question about process, I think. Translation is a polyglossic process, meaning to say there are many voices involved. And I think with regards to fan translation or fan fiction, I'm assuming that this is probably self-published or might even be online. And I think that's really it adds on to the idea of the of translation as a form of democracy in some ways. And I think it's really important because, like I said earlier, my point was about bringing in perspectives from marginal authors or marginal translators. Sorry, and I think translation is really an act in which you have to choose certain perspective, the kind of words that you want to use. So yeah, it's definitely for fan fiction and fan translation. And I think that is actually quite interesting to compare them to maybe official translations of the same text, and to see exactly how people differ in terms of their interpretation, right? I think so. So I welcome that, actually.
Oh, me too. I was going to say it's part of the play. I think it's translation is one of those things. Language is like music, and when we participate in the process of language, we are like musicians who are actually just playing around and improvising and partaking in the beauty of language or music. And so fan fiction, whether official translations, unofficial translations, I think it's all part of the play. Of course, then there's a larger process that happens when you want to start publishing and all of that. But I think the actual delving into language and delving into the imagination and delving into the mode of literary translation is something that it's a free landscape, and everyone is welcome, I think. Yeah.
I'd like to just add
Subashree,
one thing. Yeah. If that work speaks to you, I think you should just go ahead and translate it, because there will be readers for it. So if you really enjoyed it so much, I think you should just go ahead and translate it and put it out, and people will enjoy it. Yeah. So as she said, it's a free landscape.
It's as you say, Subashree. I mean, you only want to do this. Imagine someone's doing the work that under different circumstances you might demand hundreds or thousands of pounds for. Someone's willing to do it for free. It is an act of love. It is a labor of love, right? That desire is there that we were talking about. I think that is to be applauded and celebrated. You want to know the story so much, and you want to share the story so much, you're willing to put in the work. If only we had that sort of passion and desire much more often. So I would actually say yes, please. And then from there build up. What other stories? What other voices?
Alvin, can I have a quick rejoinder?
Nazry, go for that.
Yeah. I was just thinking also about the kind of ecosystem. Somebody was talking about ecosystem, Gitanjali, in the comment, and I was thinking, yes, it's good to have people translate for free out of pure fandom and just love for the work. But at the same time, I also think that the market is such that translators are not paid enough. Yes. And I think that's an issue that we didn't talk about, but it's part of that ecosystem that we need to talk about. Literary translators are underpaid and sometimes not paid enough, and tight deadlines and not recognized. And I think this is something that we need to talk about, actually. So I'm wondering if
So let's pick up on that. I think that's a relevant point. There is a recent movement the pay is one thing, very important. It's also about having the translator on the cover, which I personally take for granted is just good practice. I was shocked to realize it isn't necessarily mainstream practice to feature the translation on the cover. I'm like, that would be like, having an album of Bach cello concertos and you don't know who the musician is, to me.
Absolutely.
It's absurd, right? So there is something about the status of translation, the recognition of the value and work put into translation. Comments. What should we be doing about this?
I think we need to set examples. I think we need to set examples by really putting out projects that go against that kind of norm and start to put the translators' names on the book covers. We have to start paying them properly. Absolutely. And we also need to start, I think, well, at least in Malaysia, there isn't a lot of opportunity at all for independent translators to get any kind of resource assistance. Like there are hardly any grants, none that I know of actually, for independent translators to apply to say, I have this project. I mean, there's very, very little, and it's not part of an ecosystem. We also have a really imbalanced ecosystem, like Bilal was talking about in Pakistan. And again, they're very divided into the Malay publishing world, the Malaysian English publishing world, the Malaysian Chinese publishing world, and Malaysian Tamil publishing, which all kind of not speaking to each other.
Sadly, not very different in Singapore.
But
we'll go on.
No, and but I do think also the training of also translators to enable them to actually get language training is another thing, because like Alvin brought up earlier, the other thing that I'm passionate about is not only translating works from Malaysian languages into the world, but also translating world literature into Malay and into other Malaysian languages. And that's something that I've been doing actively. And again, I don't see also enough support for young people who want to learn a language seriously for the purposes of literary translation, to be able to do that, to master the language and delve into that world. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's also about role modeling, isn't it? We need to demonstrate what good practice looks like. So in small ways, I mean, some of the translation projects or some of the literary projects I've been involved in recently, where there is money, we've been trying to pay the translations equally with the authors.
Right.
I know that's not necessarily done everywhere, but it's a point one is trying to make, as it were. There is a question in the audience related to this that maybe might be folded in, which is Shuku Kusanagi Lee asks, what is the working relationship between translators and editors, and how far does that influence what is eventually published? So it has to do with the translation as process, administrative and otherwise, right? And it relates to payment, relates to recognition, relates to the relationship. And anyone wants to chip in on any of these points?
Alvin, can I just chip in and sort of
sure.
with a couple of thoughts about the vis-a-vis the previous question. I think that one answer could also be translation collectives, right? I mean that translators sort of come together and they share with some degree or great degree of transparency, what their modus is, and how much are they getting paid, for example, how much and perhaps they can bargain as a collective on things like what you suggested, that having name on the cover is absolutely essential. So I think that having a translator, I know that such collectives do exist in North America, but I don't think that such collectives really exist in our part of the world. At least I don't know of those. So, and I think that
No, as in we should make one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think
We don't
that
have
sort
one.
of, and sharing contacts of editors who might be interested in publishing certain kinds of works and so on and so forth. I think that sort of sharing of knowledge, sharing of information, and perhaps also then bargaining collectively if that's required. So I think that might be one answer to that question.
Yes. Can I just put in something?
Go ahead. Yeah.
We don't have a translators association or anything where we can bargain. And actually, even panels like this is so rare. I'm just so happy to be invited here, and speak to all of you. We haven't even had things like this. So it is very. I mean, we have a long way to go. And if we can put things in place, it would be so much better. And if we can translate each other, that's why I think the thing which you all are doing is really wonderful.
So there is a question from the audience that speaks to this. What are the ways and the platforms and ways in which we can start building this? Gitan, could we have Gitan's question, please, about ecosystems? So the question has to do with the ecosystem of networks and connections we've been talking about. What types of platforms, be it festivals, literary magazines, collectives, institutions, how can we begin to create these connections, right? I think there was a bit of we did talk a little bit about where we can begin to put in the resources. I, for one, would be, have been trying to see if we can pull some money together, to offer grants to people across borders. Why? If for example, a reasonably modest sum of money could get something solid going somewhere else, I personally would love to do that. And maybe individuals pulling together is enough to get something going. You know, we
Yeah,
don't have to go and found a Fortune 500 company before we begin the work. We can begin from where we are. It's about, as Bilal mentions, understanding where the opportunities are, where the needs are, and then seeing who can do what about it. What do you all think? Thoughts, folks?
So, Alvin, I just want to
Nazry.
quickly respond to that. So, it sounds very much like you're setting a Translators Without Borders kind of organization, which I would really welcome. You know, I really certainly welcome that. The only issue is that, like in Singapore, for instance, because of the just the structure of the society and bureaucracy, it will be, I guess, viewed suspiciously if you kind of unionize in a way, because Singapore is quite iffy on that front. So I think that idea of collectives as an unofficial thing definitely is can work in terms of content, but in terms of actually improving the work conditions, that would need something more international, I feel, to kind of. So we don't have that kind of international organization that actually look at the welfare of translators. Maybe we always look to PAN, maybe PAN International, even Commonwealth Foundation, but we need something more than that, I think. That could really work in our favor. So that's just my quick thought there.
I think. Sorry.
No,
Pauline, go ahead.
I just want to quickly say that in relation to the question just now, some of those platforms I think already exist. We did mention some of them, possible literary festivals, literary publications. Another one that, besides ADA, I want to mention is also Words Without Borders. If you go to the Words Without Borders site at the moment, you will find a special Malaysia issue that I guess edited with Adriana Nordin Manan. That features 6 new translations of works from Malaysian authors across a few different languages. Those kinds of platforms, I think, are very, very good and open to the diversity and really complex diversity of world literature, and try to kind of disrupt that kind of global provincialism that we all know so well. But of course, again, Words Without Borders, it is without borders, but it is also based in New York, So it's also, I think we need to really start creating other platforms that exist in our part of the world and elsewhere outside of those Western centers to just reinforce and affirm this kind of work that we're already doing actually in our respective communities.
So on that note, I think it's very important for us to keep track and keep in the loop on what each other is doing. And I want here to squeeze in a plug for a new project that Nazry and I, among others, is working on, which is a new journal, a peer-reviewed journal called PRATA, Practice, Research, and Tangential Activities. It's essentially a peer-reviewed literary journal with a focus in the Asia, specifically Southeast Asian region. And we're already starting to see for our first issue coming in a lot of work that has to do with translation and literary work. The kinds of voices, and not just voices, right, but concerns that you don't see anywhere else, that the Words Without Borders, for example, might not necessarily pick up as important. I'm not saying we're going to change the world with this, but Prata Journal is the website, and it is one of many initiatives that we're throwing into the mix. And what it seems to imply is that more and more people feel the need for things like that to happen. I think people realize things are missing, and they want to sort of pull together and try and contribute to what's going on.
Can I just very quickly
Please, go ahead.
a couple of things? So I think that people have talked about, I mean I'm a great fan of Word Without Borders, and my first translation was published there as well, but I think that they're still very country centric, right? I think that and they're more of soliciting kind of and curating is to kind of find a guest editor and then let the guest edit. I mean, I'm fine with that, but I think that what we were able to do with the ADA thing is quite extraordinary, that we issued an open call. We read whatever came to us, and there were so many people who translated for the first time, so many writers that were being translated for the first time, and as Pauline mentioned, across languages, so not necessarily the big languages, but we were very, very cognizant of the fact that we should include languages that are not, these global languages and so on. So I think that we do have an example of a platform, of the kind of platform that we need. And I think particularly with this project, I think we were able to do something quite extraordinary. I think the challenge is to really find ways to keep this going. And I think that the other thing that is just as important as Alvin said is the eros, right? Is the desire, to continue this sort of work. And I think that happens when people meet, and people kind of meet with each other and talk to each other. And I think that Nazry and I, we were part of this translation symposium, again thanks to Commonwealth. And I think that now we have this adda thing. So I mean, there are things that are moving forward and developing, and I hope that they continue to do so as we move forward.
So thank you, Bilal, for that very important point. So it does seem like institutions like the Commonwealth Foundation have important role to play as matchmakers, as it were. Not necessarily to generate that eros. Nobody can do that. You do need to have that connection, but in facilitating ways in which that desire for connection can come about in solid work. I would personally love to hear from the Commonwealth Foundation on some of the questions we've been raising, on the question of ecosystems and platforms. I would love to hear their thoughts on that. And we have with us today Janet, I believe, who is representing that foundation. Janet, you've been listening to our conversation. What say you? What's your response to some of the questions we've been mulling about?
Well, it's been fascinating. So thanks for bringing me in. So I work for the Commonwealth Foundation. And it's interesting, Bilal just mentioned the symposium that we had in Penang in 2019 and adda in almost the same sentence. And I think it's really important to do that because it's been a real journey for us at the foundation. And the translation issues that are on adda at the moment are a part of that journey. But the journey very much started for us in Penang in 2019 when we brought together writers, publishers, translators from across South and Southeast Asia. And I think the main reason that we did that was because we wanted to see if there was a way sometime in the near future, not the too distant future, where stories were being translated across languages and where English maybe didn't have to be used as the bridging language. We wanted to see ways in which those stories could be shared. And also getting people around the table was fantastic. And also this was mentioned in some of the conversations, where you eat together, you go back to the hotel together. It's all of those conversations that start up and those relationships that build through those conversations. So yeah, we live in now this virtual world where we talk online, but actually I really look forward to the day where we can get back together. And one of the recommendations that came out of that symposium in Penang was, again, what you've been talking about, was to have a translation hub, and to have a space. And it was something that the foundation was very, very keen in supporting, to see if there was some way in which we could support the funding of a hub, or to support the funding of an administrator who could bring together the people and the voices to see what magic could be created. Because for us, it's about sharing stories and having greater understanding and the richness, that you get from sharing these stories and all the different ways in which we, well, not me, I'm not a translator, but the different ways in which translators choose to translate those stories. So yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating. There's been so many threads here that we will pick up on when we move forward. And I'm sure that we'll continue this conversation moving forward with all of you. Hopefully. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I think, where there's a will, there's a way. That's what we say. So I really do hope that, language isn't a barrier. It's actually something that can enrich all of our lives. So thank you.
We do have a will, by the way, from the Singapore Book Council.
Great.
Kudos thank you, Janet, and thanks to both the Commonwealth Foundation again, and the Book Council for lending their will to us for this enterprise. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Please do jump in. Any of you who have questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists now if you have anything that pops in. But
Alvin, can I just briefly, have one more kind of shout out to Ada, and I think for the project that we
Yes.
did. I think another really extraordinary thing that we were able to do, and again thanks to the foundation and the resources and the commitment, was that we were able to publish the original languages alongside the translation, which is also very rare. And again, again, with all due respect, great respect towards Without Borders, they don't do that.
Yeah. True.
And I think that the amount, and because it takes serious commitment to work through all the technical details and the technical kind of resources you need to pull something like that off. And I think that it was, I was skeptical that we would be able to pull that off, but I think amazing job. And I think that again, Ada becomes this kind of very unique space, which features translations alongside originals. And I think, I don't know of, like, perhaps there are other spaces like that, but I don't know of any other space. So I think
I want to jump
just a
in
shout
and
out.
actually say I also love the fact that other commissioned artworks, and so beautiful new artworks to go with each piece. And I think those artworks from illustrators from the region as well, it also showcased incredible talent of illustrators from the region. And the other thing, of course, is that we also were able to, Bilal and I were able to have a conversation in the form of exchange of letters on not just the issue of the content themselves, but also issues about translation and our thoughts about translation. I think that's also very important, to showcase works of translation, but also writing and thoughts of people in that process, and some of the challenges and eros and passion that we experience in that.
So is there a commitment to keep the other project going for as long as possible?
Yeah, just to say on the languages, yeah, it was really important for us to be able to publish in the original languages, and we had that conversation with Bilal, because it's not always easy to find the font, if you like. It was a task, but I'm so glad that we did it. With Ada, absolutely, we want to continue to publish works in translation. And also we do run the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, where we accept short stories in 11 different languages, or 12 now. We've just introduced Creole as well into it. So, it is really important to us to be as inclusive as possible and to bring in those languages. And absolutely, Ada will continue to publish work in translation. It's just finding the right project moving forward, because Ada is it's an online platform, but we're a small team running it. We can't do everything that we want to, but we'll certainly will be doing more translation, definitely.
I guess if I can just plug in other platforms other than Prata and Ada, we do have Asymptote, and as well as Wasafiri. Wasafiri has now started Southeast Asian focus. So and really looking forward to writers or translations from the region. But it's been doing a really good job with South Asia as well, and also from countries from Africa, work from Africa.
There's also Lyric Line, the Berlin-based project that both Pauline and I are country editors, relatively respectively for. But it's not about who is the portal, right? It's about there just isn't enough of this work to go around still, and we're still just scratching the surface of what is available, and it's translation. And I've run into this, that there is a question in the comments about gatekeepers I'd love to pick up on, but one of the assumptions that institutions like to have is, oh, but you've already translated that book. Why should you bother to do it again? As if Dante only had one translation ever, right? Or as if there's only one, you only need to revisit a work once, as it were. In a sense, it's never enough. And every generation has to engage with its important thoughts and across communities over and over again. So this is work that there can never be enough of. And I really want to add to applauding the Commonwealth Foundation's efforts in this direction for adding their voice to this. So the question, and thank you so much, Janet, for joining us for this segment. The question is about gatekeepers. Shah's travel poet, I believe, Trevet poet, asks, has any of you come up against gatekeepers, and how do translators negotiate past these to gain access to authors or poets who aren't well known globally? And I want to add to this a question by Amanda Flynn, which is more specifically about Singapore, but I think it's also about a different kind of gatekeeping, which has to do with language proprieties and assumptions about what we are supposed to speak, right? And supposed to do. Will these forms of gatekeeping, these forms of constraint, have we faced them in the past? How do we overcome them? Might they in fact reduce the space for translation and exchange in the future, even as we try and push forward with it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I pick up on that Singapore bit and then move slowly, and then maybe leave the floor for others to say something. Yeah, certainly, I think the mother language policy in Singapore, and if you don't know Singapore so well, we have English medium instruction, and then if you a Malay speaker, for instance, then you take Malay as a mother tongue language. And so what's happened recently is that more and more people are more proficient in English and possibly Singlish, but not so much in their mother tongue languages. So Singapore is facing a kind of dying out of the mastery of their mother tongue languages. And certainly there are no kind of cross learning between the mother tongue languages. And I think that is an issue and it's a problem. And I think that that the issue here is that we don't get to cross translate like Alvin was saying earlier. And I think going back to Pauline's point about trying to understand language, is very important that we position the study of languages as something that is policy. Something that can be taught in schools and should be made available. And I think we should prioritize languages within the region as opposed to world languages like French and English and stuff like that. So I think I'll just answer quickly to that. I mean, I face my own issue of gatekeeping. And I think another question was about editors, relationship between editors and this one. And I think actually the relationship, at least working with the editors myself, have been quite productive and very generative, I would say. I'll stop there and then just give the floor to others, I think.
Yeah, I just like to say about
Subashree and then Pauline.
Yeah, Subashree, go ahead.
Okay, I just like to say about languages. I think children are very, very resilient. In India, I think many children, they know 2 or 3 languages and they speak them effortlessly. So I think children learning 2 or 3 languages will never be that much of a problem. I think they will learn it pretty well. So they can learn 2 or 3. Yeah.
I think I just wanted to chime in on Nazry's point, because of course, and also to Amanda's question, because Malaysia is similar in that respect. We have our main instruction in Malay, and then we are allowed to learn whichever minority language. But yes, it does hinder actually a lot of translation between those vernacular languages. Much more that has to happen actually. In the 1980s, and actually there are some small efforts by Malay publishers. In the 1980s, I think Dewan Bahasa was actually doing quite a bit of translation from the Chinese, including Mahua writers into Malay. Some of that has kind of dwindled a bit, but there are other publishing centers like Nusa Center, for example, that is run by SM Zakir. He has been doing a project, I don't think it's published yet, but he's been doing a very important project of translating short stories by Mahua writers into Malay. And those kinds of efforts, I think, are really, really important. But a lot more has to be done in the Tamil community, for example. I really hardly know anything about the obviously rich production of Tamil literature in Malaysia, partly because there is so little translation into other languages, into Malay and into English and into any other language. And the same goes for the indigenous languages. I think the indigenous languages are incredibly rich, and they encompass not just written literature, but oral literature. And there's really not enough conversation or encouragement of that as well. Yeah, so we are very complex societies, and And I think institutionally and at the education level, it doesn't really reflect the complexity. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for chiming in. Just like this work can never be, there cannot not be enough effort in this direction. We're just scratching the surface. So to our panel, it's been really rich, but we could have just gone on for hours, right? But unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left. So I'd like to perhaps not call the conversation to an end, but to pause it, and perhaps have all of you share one quick thing just to finish off with. And if you could each perhaps share one thing that gives you hope for the future of translation in our region. One thing that gives you hope to share with our audience. Who would like to go first?
I can go.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
I mean, this is hope, right? I think that all of us together, practitioners, editors, publishers, and I think that in my case and perhaps Pauline's case, and I think others as well, that we're kind of all of those things, right? And I think that just this desire and just this having this uh, deeply how do you say I think moving conversation in some respects, although we talked about a lot of functional stuff, but I think that just hearing these concerns amplified and kind of resonate across people from and translators and practitioners from across the region, I mean, gives you hope that perhaps here is where the germ of further future collaboration is, and perhaps we can find ways to come together and build whatever is needed for the kind of future that we have sort of we desire. And I say, so I think that this, for me, this is where it's at.
Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, Pauline.
Nasri first, it's fine.
No, Pauline, you want to go first?
I'm still brewing. Go ahead.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So I teach in a university as well, and I deal with a lot of young people, and my encounters with them, I'm very encouraged by an increased curiosity, but also appetite for reading works that are from this part of the world, Asia Pacific, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and I'm thinking about how my work coincides with that, how the Ramayana has been translated into Malay in the past, etc. So thinking about classics and Southeast Asian classics, South Asian classics translated into English. It's not ideal that we are using English as a bridge language, but this is something positive coming out of it. And hopefully, the next step would be to cross-translate, like we talked earlier. So that's really hopeful for me, just this kind of appetite or curiosity about, learning others, right?
Thank you, Nasri. Pauline, Subashree?
Okay. Pauline?
Go for it.
I just quickly want to say, this conversation absolutely gives me hope. Other conversations that I have with, for example, the Malay literary community, especially the younger ones who are extremely actually active in reading, some also in translation. I think there's a kind of reignited passion for the written word and for literature, especially in Malaysia, I would say, particularly among the young Malay readers. I don't see it as much in the middle-class English-speaking literary community. I think really a lot of interest and fire and passion at the moment is in the Malay language literature. And that gives me a lot of hope, because the conversations, so English is not necessarily the only bridge language that we talk about. We do have very many conversations in Malay as well. And I'm sure also in the respective South Asian languages, but all these conversations, I think, are shards of hope and windows into possibilities that we can work on in the future.
I think initiatives like these, as she pointed out, really good. And I've also done workshops in colleges, and the students were really very enthusiastic. But I don't know what they will do after the workshop, because it's so demanding, their courses, and they tell me that they'll keep at them. But the 3 days they thoroughly enjoy themselves and they work in groups and they really produce some good stuff. But I don't know how they will continue. But what gives me hope are the translators themselves. They really keep going. I don't think they bother about anything. If they really want to translate something, they don't even bother, if it's being commissioned. They just start doing the work. So that really, I suppose, gives one a lot of hope. Yeah.
Thank you. And of course, what gives me hope is that we among us are saying these things and resonated, vibrating with each other, in fact. But there's also, we're not just preaching to the converted, there is an audience listening who have been very engaging with their comments and questions. And they give, I think they give all of us hope that, the eros is there, the desire is there. And maybe one day, because the will is there, we can turn this eros into a sense of family, that we will continue to be with each other and find ways to do the things we need to connect and exchange. And with that, I want to close today's discussion. For now, thank you so much. Once again, Bilal, Pauline, Nazry, and Subashree, and Janet earlier, and everyone who's been here listening to us and contributing your questions. We hope this has been fruitful for all of you. It certainly has been very moving and enriching, nourishing, I would say, for me, and I hope for many of you as well. Just some practical housekeeping, a few announcements. If you have missed the earlier sessions of this symposium, the videos are available online on the Book Council website and Facebook page. Please help us to also improve our sessions by completing the evaluation form, very Singaporean, the feedback form. There will be a QR code on your screen to access the feedback form. There will be one final panel on 30th September, International Translation Day, titled Translating the Everyday. So you can find out more details on the website. And once again, thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. As a final treat, don't go away yet, we are going to share with you a very special video, courtesy of the Commonwealth Foundation folks, featuring excerpts from the project that Pauline and Bilal have put together, poems from the South and Southeast Asian collection on adda. And the website is Adda Stories, ADDA stories.org, where you can read the complete collection in both the original languages and English translations. So what we're going to screen now is a video with some excerpts, followed by short performances, actual performances from two of the poets involved, Malaysia's Muhammad Haji Saleh and the Kannada poet Mamta Saga, who is, I believe, in the audience with us today as well. So once again, thank you, enjoy the video, and not goodbye, but till we meet again somewhere in the world. Thank you all.
Thank you.
3000缕情愫自6月初9开始，被紧紧挽在脑后，顺溜、觅食、服帖，再也不能随意飞扬，不能招风，不能装扮。凡触及他的眼神，无不伤痛；目光无不黯然惆怅。
Noong mangale, numit amata kare, masitang mangaire, mangonda pauriba. Hayang sulai mangonda, ngarang dong na matsatki, ngasi hayang, satki asum. Kadaino, karino, nupi layma, manabu kari tau krabage.
बच्चे को क्या पता, सबके जीवन में आता है वो क्षण जब माएं उन्हें उतार देती हैं गोद से, फिर कभी नहीं उठाने के लिए। मैं क्रेडिट कार्ड से रेत सकता हूं किसी का गला, मैं सरकार नहीं चुन सकता। इसलिए 575 विकल्पों से लड़ झगड़ कर मैंने चुना है टूथपेस्ट। आप भी मुस्कुराइए। धन्यवाद।
படர் நெடும் மின்கொடிச் சரமும் உங்கள் இராவை நினைக்கையில் பொங்கி பிரகாசம் கொள்ளும் உங்கள் நகரத்தை, போகமும் போதையும் மிஞ்சித் தள்ளாடும் நள்ளிராக்களை தூக்கத்தினால் மூடி நீங்கள் புரள்கையில் சன்னங்களாலும் பீரங்கிகளாலும் உடைத்து திறக்கப்படுகிறது ஊரடங்கிய வேறொரு நகரம். பசியும் வெளியும் தீரா பீதியும் பிடித்த நள்ளிராக்களை, பெருக்கெடுக்கும் இரத்த தெருக்களை தூங்காத கண்களால் கடக்கிறார்கள் இன்னொரு தலைநகரத்து மக்கள்.
යුගයකින් යුගයකට විතැන් වූ නුවර පිට පවන් මත පවා කව් ලියා පා කළ බිමෙක නහර ඇට මස් බදා විජිතයේ කපුළු හැර ප්‍රාණයක් පතිත විය ජීවයක් දී අයද වහා ගිනිගෙන දැවුණු විජිතයක පරාජිත කස තැලුම් පහරකා මුර්ජාව උන්නුඹට ආලෙසක් නොවිසා නිදන්නට දී ගැඹුර නිවන්නට සෑ මතට පැන දැවුනෙමත් මාය.
अगू है कमिश्नर घंटा घर दियां बुरजियां उत्ते चढ़िया, घंटा घर दे डाने तू डरिया, तबादला कराया इस शहर विच वल ना आया। अगू एक मकैनिक आया, अगू एक फोटोग्राफर, अगू एक कमांडर। इस शहर अपने शायर को छेकड़ी एक मौका पे देंदा है।
Merdeka itu bebas kembali ke teduh kampung atau terbang ke sempadan bangsa-bangsa. Bebas berfikir dan bebas merasa, bebas membesar dari kata dan bebas dari tikam kuku dan dompet peniaga dan banknya. Bebas menyanyi lagu sendiri, menarik nasib di baris dondang sayang dan lebur dalam irama cair syairnya. Bebas menyusun kata yang tumbuh dari tanah air marwah.
Hi, I am Mamta Sagar, writing in Kannada language spoken in the southern part of India. This poem is called Trapped Song. ಬಿಡಿಸಲಾಗದ ಹಾಡು. ಒಂದು ಮೋಡ ತೇಲಿ ಬಂತು ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೆ, ಪೆನ್ಸಿಲ್ಲಿನ ದಪ್ಪ ಸೀಸದ ಮೊನಚು ತುದಿ ಮೊಂಡಾದಂತೆ ದುಂಡಗೆ ಮೋಡ ದಪ್ಪವಾಗುತ್ತಾ ಕಂದಾಗುತ್ತಾ ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೆ ಮಬ್ಬು ಕವಿತಿತ್ತು. ಸುಯ್ಗುಡದ ಸುಂಟರ ಗಾಳಿ, ತರಗೆಲೆಗಳು ಸರ ಬರ ಅನ್ನದು. ಕಾದ ಮಣ್ಣು ಘಮಗುಡುವ ನೆನಪು, ದನಿ ಗುಡುಗಿ ಹನಿ ಬಿತ್ತು. ಹಾಳೆ ಮೇಲೂ ಗಾಳಿ ಬೀಸಿ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕದ ಬಳ್ಳಿಗಳಿಂದ ಅರಳದ ಮೊಗ್ಗುಗಳುದುರಿ ಹಾಳೆ ತುಂಬ ಅಕ್ಷರಗಳು ಚೆದುರಿ ಮನದಲ್ಲಿ ತುಳುಕಲಾಗದ ತರಂಗಗಳು ಮೂಡಿತ್ತು. ಖಾಲಿ ಹಾಳೆಯ, ಕಪ್ಪು ಮೋಡದ, ಬೀಳದ ಮಳೆಯ, ಬಿದ್ದ ಅಕ್ಷರಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬಿಡಿಸಲಾಗದ ಹಾಡು ಸಿಲುಕಿತ್ತು. ಹೀಗೊಂದು ಪುಟ್ಟ ಮೈ, ಹೀಗೊಂದು ಪುಟ್ಟ ಮೈ, ಮೈಯೊಳಗೆ ಮನಸ್ಸು, ಮನಸ್ಸಿಗೊಂದು ಹೃದಯ. ಮನಸ ಮೈಯಿಗೂ ಮೈಯ ಮನಸ್ಸಿಗೂ ನಂಟೇನಾದರೂ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಒಂದೇ ಅನಿಸಿದರೂ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಜಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಲೆವ ಹಾಗೆ, ಜತೆಯಲ್ಲಿದ್ದರೂ ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಇರುತ್ತವೆ ದೂರವಿದ್ದ ಹಾಗೆ. ಮೈ ಮಾಯೆಯೋ ಮನಸ್ಸು ಮಾಯೆಯೋ, ಮೈ ಮಾಯೆಯೋ ಮನಸ್ಸು ಮಾಯೆಯೋ, ಮಾಯವಾಗಿ ಹೃದಯ. ಮಾಯೆಗೊಂದು ಮೈ, ಮಾಯೆಗೂ ಮನಸ್ಸು, ಇದು ಮಾಯಾ ಹೃದಯ. ಮನಸ ಮೈಯಿಗೆ ರೆಕ್ಕೆ ಪುಕ್ಕ ಹಾರೊಕ್ಕೆ ತೆರೆದ ಬಾನು, ಮೈಯ ಮನಸ್ಸು ನೀರಾಗಿ ಕರಗಿದರು ಹರಿಯಲಾರದೇನು. 100 ಮೈ, 100 ಮೈ, 100 ಮನಸ್ಸುಗಳ ಹಂಗು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹಾರಿ, ಎಲ್ಲೋ ನೆನಪಿನಲ್ಲಿ, ಉಸಿರ ಲಯದಲ್ಲಿ, ಹಗಲ ಇರುಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳಿದು ಉಳಿದು ಉಳಿದು ಅಳಿದು ಇನ್ನೆಲ್ಲೋ ಸುಳಿಯುವುದು. ಸ್ತಬ್ಧ ಮೈ, ನಿಶ್ಶಬ್ದ ಮನಸ್ಸು, ಲಯಬದ್ಧ ಮಿಡಿಯೋ ಹೃದಯ. ಶಿಸ್ತು ಬೇಕೆ ಕವಿತೆಗೆ? ಶಬ್ದದ ಕಾಲಿಗೆ ಅರ್ಥದ ಮುಳ್ಳು, ಕುಂಟೋ ಶಬ್ದ, ಕುಣಿಯೋ ಅರ್ಥ, ಅಸ್ತವ್ಯಸ್ತ ಲೋಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಿಸ್ತು ಬೇಕೆ ಕವಿತೆಗೆ? ಶಬ್ದ ತತ್ತರಿಸಿ 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 ನಡೆವಾಗ, ಶಬ್ದ ತತ್ತರಿಸಿ ನಡೆವಾಗ, ತೊದಲುವಾಗ, ತಡೆ ತಡೆದು ನುಡಿವಾಗ, ಅರ್ಥ ಹೊತ್ತ ಮಾತ ಮೈ ತೂರಾಡುತ್ತದೆ. ಎಡವಿ ತಡವರಿಸಿ ನಡೆಯುತ್ತದೆ. ಕವಿತೆಯೋ ಶಬ್ದದ ಅರ್ಥದ ಹಂಗು, ಶಬ್ದದ ಅರ್ಥದ ಹಂಗು ತೊರೆದು ಶಬ್ದಾರ್ಥವ ಮೀರಿ ಮೋಹಕ್ಕೆ ವಶವಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಹೆಕ್ಕಿದ ಪದಗಳು ಚಲ್ಲಾಪಿಲ್ಲಿ ಚೆಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ಕಟ್ಟುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ಕವಿತೆ ಕೈಗೆ ಸಿಕ್ಕದಾಗಿ. ಮೋಹ, ಮೋಹ ಮತ್ತಿನ್ನೇನು? ಮೋಹಿಸಿದಷ್ಟು ಮತ್ತಷ್ಟು ಗುಣ ಮಾಡಿಸುತ್ತದೆ. ಕಡಿವಾಣಗಳ ಕಳಚುತ್ತ, ಸಂಕೋಲೆಗಳ ಸೀಳುತ್ತ, ಪಾದ 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 ಮುನ್ನಡೆದ ಹಾಗೆ, ಪದ 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 ಮುನ್ನಡೆದ ಹಾಗೆ, ಚಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋದಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲ ಹೂ ಬಿಟ್ಟ ಪದಗಳು ಕೈತುಂಬ ಮೈತುಂಬ ಕವಿತೆ ಕಟ್ಟುವ ನಶೆ. ಸಾಲುಗಳು ಒಂದರ ಹಿಂದೊಂದು ತೂರಾಡುತ್ತ ತಾರಾಡುತ್ತ ಅಮಲೇರಿ ಸಾಲುಗಳು. ಶಬ್ದದ ಅರ್ಥದ ಮೋಹದ ಮೆಲುಕು ಹಾಕುತ್ತಿರುವಾಗ ಶಿಸ್ತು ಬೇಕೆ ಕವಿತೆಗೆ? ಈ ಅಸ್ತವ್ಯಸ್ತ ಲೋಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಿಸ್ತು ಬೇಕೆ ಕವಿತೆಗೆ?